Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by returning guests, Dr. Todd Shackelford and Dr. Viviana Weekes-Shackelford. Todd has already been with us 2 times before, and Viviana, I've interviewed her 1 time. And they are both from Oakland University. Guys, welcome to the show again, and thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, our pleasure.
Okay, we've decided between us to talk a little bit about today about what happens with people and their mating lives after they have children, right? So, because I guess that's a very interesting topic to explore, and I have yet to talk about it with anyone from evolutionary psychology and even psychology in general for that matter. So the first question I would like to ask you is, do we know in evolutionary psychology if there are any trade-offs that people consider after they have had children in terms of mating and sexuality?
Certainly. Well, of course, a major trade-off is just between investing in parenting. I'm sorry, you wanted me to speak to the issue of after having kids. Yeah. So there's a fundamental trade-off between parenting, and that is investing in parenting and investing in mating. And I mean, there's a lot of work in both humans and non-humans on this issue. And I mean, the bottom line is the more time and effort and attention is invested in mating or seeking mates, the less time there can be for investing in children. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but it's a broad way of thinking about a very basic trade-off. That is one between parenting and mating. And so, I mean, you mentioned that we've been thinking for many years about, whether or not psychology, or human psychology, might be sensitive to whether or not one does have children. I mean, it seems like it certainly should be the case. I mean, having and raising children is a major set of adaptive problems, and we wondered, beginning many years ago, whether or not having children might actually impact people's efforts or attempts at mating, particularly when the mateship that produced those children, for example, may have dissolved. And the question is whether or not the same psychology continues to operate. So yes, I mean, the bottom line is it's riddled with, mating and parenting are, two very broad sets of adaptive problems that a lot of previous work suggests there are important trade-offs, and we've begun sort of thinking about applying this to human psychology in a way that we don't think others have previously, or at least infrequently. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so that's actually what I was going to contribute there. That so for, I don't know, when I was introduced to evolutionary psychology, I think that thinking about parenting and mating effort, it's sort of this dichotomous relationship, right, or lack of a relationship. And we started talking and thinking about, well, maybe it's not so clean, once you have children, right? So it can't be the case that you're doing one or the other, meaning you're not doing the other one, at all. And so we began, that line of questioning. So how does, someone having a child, how does that impact their dating and dating or mating or, relationship activity after having children or after being divorced? Just with, anecdotal references that we discussed, there are many single moms and dads who are dating, right? Dating goes on after having children. Sex goes on after having children. There's some research that we collected, some data many years ago on older people, older couples, and it's like this a whole new world of sexual activity and gossip and everything going on even in older age, right? So, so that together we sort of continue to explore this idea. Like, there must be, more to this than, okay, well, that's it. A woman has children and she's out the mating market. She might be at a different level of the mating market, but there's still something going on there.
Mm-hmm. So there's a very interesting bit there that you said, Viviana, where you referred to the fact that, I guess, you're not considering the possibility that after having children, people completely put aside their mating and sexual lives. I mean, when we're talking about trade-offs here, is more in terms of, okay, what is the percentage of the time maybe that people devote to looking for mates if they don't have one, or dedicating some time to their own mate, or to sexual activity, and the percentage of time and effort that they put into parenting. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the case that, if a woman has a child, she's out of the mating market, I would say it's the complete opposite. It's in her interest to secure, more resources and ensure that she's, obtains resources and support until the child reaches reproductive age, right? But I do have to say that it's not that it's a necessity, and again, I'm speaking to the sort of moral and environment that we're in right now, that it's not that a woman needs a man to take care of her child, of course, but so we're speaking in terms of, evolutionarily and theoretically speaking, on average, it might have been better for women ancestrally to have a mate, or at minimum, we can just focus on the resources, having the resources to, raise that child to reproductive age. So in our environment, it might not be necessary to have the actual man, just having the resources, so.
Do you want to add anything, Todd? Or
yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that. So we're talking about whether or not women. We'll just talk for the moment about women who have children. Certainly, they're still interested in securing a partner.
Right.
But then I was actually also thinking about another interesting set of questions: is whether or not their mate preferences, for example, change once they do have children.
Right.
And I think we've collected some data. I don't know if we've actually published anything on this, but we've certainly presented a couple of talks at different conferences, and we've talked about it. There is some evidence that mate preferences do change in predictable ways. So, for example, while women still certainly report an interest in access to resources, good financial prospects in a prospective partner, and that's true once they have children. But what seems to be more important is his interest in parenting. I mean, some of these are not, super difficult to understand, but the same woman, once she has children, now expresses a greater interest in not just a good parent, but emotional stability, dependability, the sorts of things that you might anticipate that women would prioritize if they did have children. Interest in home and children is another one. One other thing I'll mention is that they actually also report a significantly decreased interest in physical attractiveness of a long-term partner.
So they're not as interested after they have children in having a partner
who's physically attractive.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like trade-offs within women's mate preferences. I mean, given that you can't have everything, I mean, very few people command the kind of mate value that they get everything they want. And so what you see is that once women have children, and we've looked at this with men to some extent, but much more focus on women, women trade off physical attractiveness for dependability and emotional stability, for example. Interest in children and family life, which again, I don't think, we're not claiming this is like rocket science, but it seems to be sort of playing out in the way that you might anticipate if there are these trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let me just go back a little bit because there's a very important point there. I mean, when you were saying a few minutes ago, Viviana, that I guess we have to take into account that it's not the case that a single woman can't raise her children without any help, I guess that there are two things there to clarify, particularly because, unfortunately, evolutionary psychology is very easily associated with right-wing politics, because people are talking about the biological basis for human behavior, and that's very unfortunate. So, I mean, there's that right-wing argument that things like child support by the state, it's undermining the nuclear family and things like that. But I guess that another thing that we have to take into account is that even during our evolutionary history, it's not the case that women depended exclusively or only on men to provide them with resources. We also had a lot of cooperative breeding.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that that might be just as important for a single mother raising a child, to have that, whether it's family or, very close friends to help raise that child. It's a key element in, healthy mind, healthy raising that child, to have sort of, a support system. Yeah.
Which may or may not include a long-term partner.
Right.
I mean, in fact, there are also risks with, once a woman has had a child, if she's attempting, and it's true for men as well, but if she's attempting, but more so for women, if she's attempting to attract another mate, well, yes, he may provide resources, but he also may present a risk to her child, to her and her child, in terms of physical abuse, neglect, and indeed, in some of our work, filicide or killing of the child. And we know that residence with a step-parent is the most, if not certainly one of the most, but it's just an extraordinary risk factor for child abuse, neglect, and murder. And so there's also those trade-offs. To think about. So there are costs as well. The sorts of costs that you don't incur if you're relying on kin, mother, sister, nieces, to help with raising. They're terribly unlikely to abuse, neglect, and murder your child.
One interesting thing there to add is that if there is a step-parent or stepfather, we're talking about specifically, if he and the mother of that child share a child, then the risk of child abuse and just conflict in general in the household seems to diminish. So what I'm saying there is that there is, in terms of, the abuse and conflict in the relationship, having a child, sharing a child with those two, kind of diminishes some of that conflict and reduces the likelihood of child abuse and neglect towards that child, because they share a common interest in that relationship.
Mm-hmm. So, this is perhaps a very complicated question, because it will involve several different factors, let's say. But, and I don't know if we already know anything about this or not, but since men have that issue with paternity uncertainty, do we know if men are more prone to be violent toward their children just because they are never 100% sure that they are their true parents, let's say?
Yeah, there's no doubt that, there is one age of child where women are far more likely to be murderous, and that is in the first 24 hours after birth. So what's referred to as neonaticide. The bottom line is, if somebody's going to kill the baby, it's going to be the mother in that first 24 hours. So women are, in fact, far more likely to commit filicide of an infant. That is, of an infant within the first 24 hours of life. Part of it is just statistically speaking, she's going to be there. She's birthing the baby. But beyond that, there's no doubt that men are more violent generally in virtually every context. And so it is also the case that men are more violent, abusive, neglectful towards children, towards their own children. Although I'm not sure if that's true once you control for the statistical likelihood or the availability of engaging in any interaction. I mean, women spend far more time with their children than do men on average. And so, I mean, if you control for the amount of time spent together, I guess that would actually work against what I was just saying. So the bottom line is, yes, men are more violent, and in fact, they may look even more so once you control for the fact that they spend significantly less time with their children. If you just look at frequencies, this is what I wanted to say. If you just look at frequencies of violent occurrences, it might be that women engage in more frequent neglect, abuse. I don't know about filicide.
I think I think for filicide, I think if you just look at frequencies, it's not that different for males and females, so mothers and fathers. But that's looking at data points that are obtained from, police department. So they're not taking into account things like how much time is spent together. So I think that's a critical thing to keep in mind when you're, interpreting those results.
Right. Well,
but
Well, I was just going to say, with filicide, though, what's different about filicide is that it can only happen once. I mean, there's a frequency of 1. I mean, the kid's killed within a particular woman, but then within men and women, of course, men can be abusive, neglectful multiple times, as can women. And I think the frequencies might not be that different, as Viviana is suggesting. But when you control for opportunity, that I think that men are far more likely to be neglectful and abusive. I mean, they spend so much less time on average with children. And so if the frequencies are about the same, well, then that suggests that the rates are much higher for men, given the less frequent interaction.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, all of these kinds of neglect and violence that we're talking about here, I mean, they represent a very little percentage of occurrences, right? I mean, it's not the case that this is in any way widespread, either for mothers and for fathers to neglect or to be violent in a relevant or a significant way toward their children, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's fair to say. Although, there's a lot of, discussion right now on, what counts as abusive. I mean, we've been thinking a lot in different work on, what's something like spanking, for example. I mean, that's illegal in some states, whereas, and it's still practiced. And so, I guess there you're getting into the definitions. But the bottom line is, in terms of, it's highly damaging physical abuse, for example. Yes, I mean, I think on average, parents are not, frequently abusing their children. I mean, it's relatively infrequent. But again, relatively speaking, it's much more frequent with parents of stepchildren. And it's relatively more frequent with men than it is with women, I guess, in terms of frequency as a function of opportunity. But getting back to your original question, so I mean, so there's two alternatives. Well, one alternative is that men are just more violent. That's why they're more likely to be, abusive. Another possibility is that their violence is sort of an expression of their, the fact of paternal uncertainty. I think the work that speaks best to that is the kind of work that Gordon Gallup and others have done, which shows that men who perceive that the child looks less like them are in fact more likely to be abusive and neglectful toward that child. And you don't see that kind of variation in women's neglect, abuse, and for that matter, murder. So something in male psychology seems to be sensitive to sort of a downstream proxy of likelihood of relatedness. I mean, men don't typically say, I don't think the kid is mine. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary if that's, they don't usually say that. It's not part of the conscious sort of articulation of the evolved psychology. But the data indicate that men are more likely to be abusive towards those children that they perceive look less like them, have different personality characteristics from them. And the most important point of this is that you do not see that kind of variation in women's behavior towards their children. Women don't report being more abusive towards kids that look less like them. Women's abuse doesn't vary as a function of perceived, we can think of it as perceived maternity. There's no variation there. Yeah.
Yes, and that's very...
Yeah.
Yes, and that's very interesting. And let me just ask you, couldn't it be another source of evidence for us to use here to understand if really paternity uncertainty is what's behind, or a major factor behind paternal neglect or violence, let's say, to study how paternal and maternal grandparents deal with their grandchildren, because there could be some difference there, right? Because since the maternal grandparents would be in principle more certain that those are really their grandchildren, then it might that might manifest in terms of being more or less neglecting or more or less violent toward them, or investing more or less in them, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we did some work on this a few years ago on grandparental investment, and this is work with a former student, Rick Mahalski. I can't remember if you were on that paper. Yeah. At any rate, that's exactly what we found. This was a study of grandparents and asking them about their investment in their grandchildren, and what we predicted and what we found. Now, we weren't the first to reach this prediction. We were attempting to replicate some previous work where they had asked grandchildren about differential investment of different grandparents. Well, we had the opportunity to ask grandparents how they invested. You know, you got to be real careful, because grandparents are very funny about sort of admitting to differential attention. Bottom line, fathers, that is, the paternal grandfather was the least investing. The maternal grandmother was the most investing. So the lingo in the field is mo, mother's mother, and fa, father's father. Just exactly as you would expect, because mother's mother is definitely the maternal grandmother. But there's no links of uncertainty there. Okay, and grandparents are reporting that they favor. We had to be careful on how we asked this, but they were investing more in grandmother's mother was investing the most by her own reports, which replicated grandchildren's reports. Grandchildren were saying mother's mother invests the most, spends the most time with me, buys me the best gifts, tells me she loves me. Father's father invested the least. And this is by grandfather's own reports. Father's father invested the least, which replicates grandchildren's reports of their grandparents' investment. So yes, and the argument there is that, I mean, there may be alternative explanations, but we haven't thought of one better than the likelihood of relational uncertainty. That's what we called it. So with mother's mother, you have 0 links of relational uncertainty. With father's father, you have 2. Where things get interesting is in between there, with mother's father and father's mother. And some people argued, well, you're just finding a super male effect or a super female effect with mother's mother, because mothers socioculturally are expected to invest more, fathers expected to invest less. Maybe there's nothing evolutionary about it. I mean, it's a silly way to frame it, but you get what I'm saying. And so we said, well, let's look at what's happening in between there, in the father's mother and mother's father. If the sociocultural explanation was right, you would expect father's mother to invest more than mother's father. That's not what we found. We found that mother's father was investing more. And now, there's some speculative that's not the right word. There's a little bit of work suggesting that the rates of infidelity correspond to those findings. In other words, that mother's father, the infidelity link was less tenuous. Sorry, the relational link was less tenuous in that generation than it was in mother's generation. All of which is to say, there's a lot more interesting work to do. But some of the initial work suggests that, yes, paternal certainty or uncertainty, as it were, can impact not just parental-child relationships, but grandparental relationships.
Did you guys control for time, distance?
Yes, yeah. And we controlled for distance, we controlled for the grandparent's income, we controlled for distance, residential distance from the child. And so it wasn't just that it was easier for mother's mother to invest than it was for father's father. So we did all those sorts of controls as well.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's now talk specifically about the sorts of activities that having children might affect after the fact, of course. So, I mean, is it the case that after people had children, they move onto a mode, let's say, where they are tweaked toward investing more of their time and resources in raising the child than investing the same sorts of things in their mate and their romantic relationship?
Yeah. Oh, certainly. I mean, that's a huge, source of conflict. So one of the things that comes to mind in you asking that question is frequency of sex, after having children, right? So, I mean, this is a very, I think, sensitive area. I was just reading an article a little bit earlier. It's not a scientific one. Back in, I think it was April or so. And so they were looking at, sex after 5 years of marriage, 10 years, 20 years. And I mean, based on, some of, previous research, and I think you've got some married couples data on this, but it seems to be all over the place in terms of frequency of sex. And it's certainly, an area that I think, I would say that there's a lot of, individual variation or,
Sure.
Within couples. I mean, one of the things that come to mind, when thinking about the, source of conflict, I can't help but think about the maternity certainty and, paternal uncertainty, that, women are, certain of their children. So they're, the trade-off, it seems like it would be less of a trade-off, right? It's sort of, okay, well, I must invest in my children. Whereas with males, it's a little more of a conflict in their psychology.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any work on that, but that's a wonderful hypothesis.
Right.
I mean, I think there certainly is anecdotal evidence that, men appreciate that conflict. Well, that the conflict is more, sort of intense for men than it is for women. And
the internal dialogue, so I can imagine that men can appreciate that, though they know that the mother is the mother of their child, so they have to, and they also want, their mother, they're not their mother, but the child's mother to invest in the child, right? So this internal dialogue, my guess is louder for males than it is for females. A bottom line is that there's just not enough sex happening for males,
right?
Once they have children.
Well, I mean, that's generally true.
Right.
I mean, sexual frequency is, in many data sets, the single most important conflict as reported by both men and women. I mean, for different reasons. Women will report that he wants to have sex too much, and men will report she doesn't want to have sex enough. And that conflict is there even in couples who don't have children. I think the conflict, I mean, in some sense, we know once you control for age, I mean, sexual frequency does decrease with age. I'm stumbling because there's just no good empirical work on issues of conflict surrounding sexual frequency that takes into account the presence of children. I think it's just something that hasn't been investigated. I mean, the general, there's no doubt that the data indicates, as Viviana mentioned, that sexual frequency decreases, with age. But even if you control for age, sexual frequency decreases with children. And I think the key determinant of the intensity of conflict, or a key determinant, must be some kind of proxy of paternal certainty. My guess is that the conflict will become more intense for men who have suspicions of paternity, not consciously articulated, whereas the conflict actually might become less or remain right where it was for men who are not, who don't have suspicions of paternal uncertainty. All of which is to say, there's virtually nothing on this in the empirical literature. I think part of the problem, and this is what we kept running into, is that, I mean, weirdly, there's very little work on how having children affects male and female psychology. I mean, there really is very little work. I mean, we're culpable as well for having done decades of work on, undergraduate psychology students, who haven't had kids, and we're interested in mate preferences and sexual interests. But then what we sort of keep bumping into is that, there's virtually no work on psychology post-children or once children enter the picture. And I think it's a really interesting, I say weird because you'd think that evolutionary psychologists would be all over this because, I mean, having kids, that's a major adaptive sort of problem and a major sort of feature of our evolutionary history, an important feature. And yet, there's remarkably little work on psychological changes as a function of having kids.
Well, I think so. A lot of the research, there is research on remating, remarriage,
True. Yeah.
right? But that's outside of evolutionary psychology. So there is a lot of that, but their focus is not on the effects of children on parents' mating psychology. What the focus primarily is that looking at sexual attitudes towards dating, negative outcomes for children if parents remarry, negative like adolescent behavior,
Right.
Maladaptive behaviors. This is their words, maladaptive behaviors in adolescents and children after parents remarry. So the emphasis is really on children's outcomes and sort of the that a negative, I think, just pushing a negative connotation for dating after having children because of look at all of the negative outcomes that are possible. And so there's very little work looking at the effects of children on parents' mating psychology, and in a healthy way, because it can't be horrible, not if we think about it evolutionarily, right?
So
Yes.
what you're saying is that the work that we have in psychology, I'm not sure about the branches of psychology that do that kind of work, but that we know a little bit about how children get affected, let's say, but we don't, because people haven't approached those kinds of questions with an evolutionary perspective or with an evolutionary framework, then we are lacking the biological, maybe not biological, but evolutionary basis to how people get affected by having children in terms of their mating behavior, their sexual activity, and also their parental investment.
Yeah, and I think one of the costs, and I'm an advocate of good scientific work, and I appreciate we wouldn't be talking about other research if that research wasn't there. So I get how science works and so forth. But the reality, I think, is that so one of the costs of thinking about the previous research on negative outcomes is pushing this idea of environmental influences. Look at the parent's behavior. It's causing the child to engage in deviant sexual behaviors, which we might consider normal sexual activity in an adolescent or older teenager, without taking into account, or at least acknowledging that there might be, the product might be because of genetic relationship between the children, right? So the heritable components of sexual promiscuity we might see the same sorts of behaviors in those children. So so it's like this. It's not a real effect, or we shouldn't attribute parents' behaviors,
Right.
that as a direct link to the child's behaviors or attitudes.
Well, yeah. I mean, in fact, the work that has been done suggests that parents have remarkably little effect. Parental behavior and parental interactions have very little effect. So far, very little direct effect. It's the shared genetic effect. It's the shared genes that seem to account for correlations between parents and children. Now, I know you've spoken with, I think you spoke with one of the students in our lab, Nicole Barbero, who's done some really neat work in that area, and others. Right. I mean, but I think Viviana's point is an excellent one, which is that you get a very skewed sort of sense of what happens in relationships after having children. I mean, because so much of the focus is on how kids get screwed up, basically. And there's so much more going on than just that. But it did remind me that there is this literature in sociology. I don't know how active it is now, but certainly it was a decade ago, on the transition to parenthood, which looked at, but it wasn't informed, for the most part, it wasn't informed by an evolutionary perspective, and basically it looked at changes in the satisfaction in the relationship as a function of having children. And what they found, this is sort of a replicable finding across different data sets, but it's not very informative. They found, well, about a third of couples, the relationship worsens after children. About a third of couples, the relationship gets better after having children. About a third of couples, basically nothing changes. And that's just grist for the evolutionary psychological mill now. The question is, why? Why do things get better for some, worse for others, and stay the same, if just in this one domain of marital satisfaction or satisfaction in a relationship? And I think it's a good way of appreciating that taking an evolutionary perspective can help to focus your questions. I mean, I would want to ask, and I did as I read this literature, is, well, are there any proxies for paternal certainty or assessments of how likely he thinks he is the father? My guess is that probably is going to have an impact on how the relationship goes after that. But they don't ask those kinds of questions. So it's a really, really neat and wide open area of work.
Well, and I think the flip side of that too would be, how much support do those women have?
Oh, yeah.
Kin, close by, where she, could, share some of the child responsibility so that she could be available to work on the relationship, a little more. So
yeah.
So it could be the case that there's an element of individual difference in the way different couples experience having children and what happens after that, right? And that probably would invoke doing some work in behavioral genetics, for example. You were referring to the fact that we know that parents don't really affect children's development that much, and that has to do with that literature that studies the percentage of heritability and the shared and the non-shared environment on each psychological trait, right? And I was just wondering if maybe it could be the case that those differences that people find among couples when they're studying them, if they could derive simply from some sort of individual differences for the men or for the women, and then the sort of relationship dynamics that they establish on the basis of those same individual differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. I don't mean to, to speak poorly of that transition to parenthood literature. It's a fascinating literature, but it identifies these broad swaths of couples, some of whom do better, some worse, and some about the same. But that, to me, just sets the stage for the interesting kinds of questions that, I would want to ask. Yeah, including, were there reports of infidelity on one or both partners? Particularly relevant might be the man's suspicions of his partner's infidelities. Certainly, it would be relevant the extent to which they have particularly maternal support. So mother's genetic relatives in particular around to help with the child. My guess is that will tamp down some of the conflict that may have emerged as a function of perceptions of likely paternal uncertainty. In other words, those are just two things just off the top of my head and that we've been talking about that I think would be really interesting, and it would help us get a little farther in the work on the so-called transition to parenthood. Yeah.
I don't know if there's any work on this topic, and I guess it would be very interesting to explore it as well. But wouldn't it be interesting to try to follow couples over time and see if there are fluctuations at the level of their sexual activity? Because let me just put these hypotheses forward. Wouldn't it make sense, even from an evolutionary perspective, that, okay, so this couple had a child and now they are investing in it, and then, okay, after the child reaches a certain age where she is already somewhat independent, let's say, that range that I guess Ellen Fisher talks about the 7 years range, right, where people usually in traditional societies and also in modern societies usually break up and go looking for another partner and things like that. And then when the child had reached that age where she is a little bit independent, let's say at least enough for them to survive well enough on somewhat on their own, let's say, that their sexual activity either within the couple or with people outside of their established romantic relationship would increase, because it would make more sense for them to try to have a second and a third child to increase, of course, their fitness.
Yes, I mean, that all seems, those are all reasonable hypotheses, and I think that's what you would anticipate. And in fact, there is a little bit of work. Robin Baker and Mark Bellis published some survey research. It suggested the possibility that where there was a paternal discrepancy, so in other words, where cuckoldry actually did occur, it was most likely to occur for the second child. Again, there's lots that we can nitpick about this kind of work, but it's an interesting idea. The argument here is that, let me just say it crassly, and the idea is that a woman might sort of lure a man in, have his child, right, and sort of get him sort of locked down in the relationship, and then again, by women's own reports, they're more likely to be unfaithful and to produce a child by a different father with the second child. Now, I don't for a moment think that women plan this out, but I think the evolved machinery works in such a way as to, from the maternal side, ensure that your child has investment from the current father, and sort of lock down that first child, and then if infidelities, are on the horizon, to pursue those, subsequent to that first child. And at any rate, that's what the data seem to suggest, at least what data we do have. So yes, I mean, we'd also have to control for, of course, control for age. I mean, sexual interest for both men and women generally does decrease with age as a function of, the endocrinological, sort of status of the individual, and other issues. I mean, life gets more complicated as you age, but even so, I think your hypothesis remains a very interesting one. Even controlling for age, do you find that couples' sexual frequency increases once the child reaches, sort of a relatively independent age? I would not be shocked if that were the case. But again, I don't know of any work that's explicitly investigated that, and it's not super complicated. So that's exactly the kind of work that we think would be really interesting to pursue.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if for single parents, for single mothers and single fathers, if there are any sex differences in terms of how having children might impact their mate value in the mating market?
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So yeah, definitely. So I guess this is going back to something that I talked about a little bit earlier, that a lot of the, I would say just traditional or initial, research by evolutionary psychologists did, focus on, but the fact is that female, mate value goes down, right, after having children. And that's generally speaking, right? So one of the interesting things, I just had a thought come into mind. One of the things that, it's not published research, but we did find, let me see if I can think about this, say this correctly, that the research where we asked men if they were interested in, we had interested in having a relationship with a woman or, with children, right? What am I thinking here? You know, the
Want me to try?
one, yeah.
Yeah, I know what she's talking about. Yeah, this is work that well, at any rate.
It's not published.
Yeah, it's not published, but we asked, I'm going to just get right to it. Bottom line, men's interest in short-term sex with a woman doesn't vary with whether she has kids or not.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Okay, if she has a kid, whatever. Doesn't have a kid, whatever.
So that's kind of interesting, because what we've heard in research, throughout the years, is that her mate value decreases. That's the emphasis, right? So that's our take-home message. It's baggage. Why would a man want, a relationship with a woman? But so we took it like a step farther and, kind of distinguished between short-term and long-term relationship, and these were the same men, right? Yeah, same men, and we asked them, about whether they want to have a short-term or long-term relationship, and it didn't matter if she had a child. So It's kind of interesting. Not that it's groundbreaking or anything like that, but it's kind of, again, speaks to this male psychology that's sort of rigid in one regard, right? That he's interested in having sex, but in terms of having a long-term relationship with a woman with the children, they rated that as less interesting to them.
Right. It was right. They still would have sex with her, okay, and they'd still
But
consider a
relatively,
relationship. But I mean, she's less attractive now as a sexual partner, and as a partner generally, if she has children from a previous partner.
But would he have sex with her? Yes.
Sure. Doesn't affect his interest. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I guess that if men don't have to obligatorily invest in a child, then they just want to have sex.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of work on men's sort of very, very loose standards. If you're talking about short-term sex, right? They become much less. Some of this work by Doug Kenrick and others. That. She has to be at least if she's a long-term partner, she's got to be at least at the 70th percentile to be a long-term partner. But, short-term partner, got to be at least at the 40th percentile. So they become much less demanding.
So what we're saying, though, is this is men's interest in having sex, right? So the question then could be, okay, well, with a woman with this child, we varied the age of the child. So there's a woman with a 2-year-old, a woman with a 7-year-old, and a woman with a 13-year-old. It didn't matter what age the child was. Men were interested in having sex.
Or the sex of the child. But, a separate question is, would this woman have sex who has, a child that's 2 years old, 3 or, so that's the other side of it. So men can have all the interest they want, but then, the question is, will the woman have sex with him? And we know that, there were other variables that we'd have to include there, like how much time would pass before she would have sex with him and so forth. Right.
This is just anecdotal evidence, but there's a somewhat interesting program going on Portuguese television that is based on blind dating. They simply pair up different people that participate on the show, and they don't know one another. It's just a blind date, and it's very interesting just to notice some patterns there, because it's very rarely that a woman says yes to having a second date, but the men, almost all of them, say yes right away. But just yesterday I was watching it, and it was very interesting, because there was one woman there who had already 5 children, and then what happened was that the man that blind dated with her, let's put it that way, rejected having a second date. And I just thought, okay, this has to do with her having children already, because all the other guys were just saying yes.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, as Viviana mentioned, there's very good evidence that, women's mate value, in fact, so does men's mate value, decreases as they have children. Because it is just sort of loosely, it's baggage for men as it is for women, bringing into another relationship. But it's more sort of, it's a heavier baggage for women than it is for men. I think in part because, of course, women do the vast majority of the child care, and post-relationship, children are far more likely to reside with the mother than with the father. But it is the case that both men and women, sort of generally speaking, experience a decrease in mate value with having children. I think they're also, they're sensitive to that as well. I think both men and women are sensitive to, to the fact that children change what they bring to the table, as it were. And I think they adjust. Well, this is the argument, is that they adjust their preferences accordingly. And they don't just decrease all their preferences. It's not like women that have children are just saying, I'll just take anything. As a matter of fact, they increase the importance that they place on dependable character, emotional stability, almost as if they want to thwart, selection of a partner that's going to do bad things to their kids. Again, I think it's not just a general sort of decrease in preferences. They're shifting preferences. Some increase and some decrease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I was just wondering, you said that it also affects negatively single fathers' mate value. But I was just wondering if single fathers, fathers with children, if they couldn't have some sort of appeal to women, in the sense that if women are looking for a long-term partnership, let's say, they want a man that can prove that he is able and wanting to invest long-term in a child. And so if they notice that there's a single father that obviously is doing and is willing to do all the work, couldn't that at least have some appeal to women, because they would have direct evidence that that man over there invests really heavily in children?
I would say absolutely. That's absolutely a plus for. If you think about it from a female's perspective, and it's consistent with some of the initial research that we've done looking at mate preferences, that characteristic, interest in having a child or emotional stability, all of those things speak to having healthy relationships, right? And if he has a child, and he's exhibiting those kinds of behaviors towards that child, yes, it's direct evidence for the woman who has children that this might be, a person with a similar mate value, right, or someone that they can work with. So another thing that I think comes into this is, mate value discrepancy. So where you have a big difference, like, she's a 3 and he's a 9, or vice versa, then, that also plays a role, I would say, in, if a woman has a child, in terms of, sexual frequency in that relationship, probably sexual frequency does not go down, or the conflict is much more intense, if she has a child from a previous marriage and let's say the guy is a lot older than her, right? Because she's younger, that increases chances of infidelity, or her attractiveness is, very high. So I imagine that the conflict and, it's going to be a lot more intense in that sort of relationship. So where there's an age difference, where the guy is older, where there is a mate value discrepancy, I would say that would also, play a role in the level of conflict in the relationship, especially where there's a child from a previous relationship involved.
Right.
So let me ask you if parent-offspring conflict might also play a role in these sorts of dynamics. I've had Dr. Trivers on the show and I've asked him this directly, but so he's basically the master of parent-offspring conflict. But do you know if it would make sense that, since parents are investing in a child, that it would be in the interest of that child to prevent their parents from having more children, because then they would have to divide, let's say, their resources and other sorts of things that they invest in their children?
Well, that strikes me as, I don't know about that, because it's a double-edged sword. Yes, an additional sibling will cause some diversion of resources. It might well depend on what resources are available. If you've got lots of resources, well then investing some of them into an additional child, yes, that's a cost that has to be incurred by the child that already exists, but the benefit, of course, is that you now have a full sibling that in principle shares half your genes, or at least a quarter of them, even if the mother had a child by a different father. So I'm not sure you would always anticipate that children would never want to have a sibling, or would always want to thwart parental attempts at copulation that might produce another sibling. There may well be some interesting, breakpoints, where, okay, once resources reach a particular threshold, well then, kids might be less upset by the introduction of a new sibling, given that siphoning of resources to that new sibling wouldn't be as devastating. So anyways, the point is, that would be that would be another very interesting area to investigate. Children's interference with parental sexuality.
And I guess that would also be very interesting to explore, because, it would enter into conflict, I guess, with the fact that it seems that people that are lower in terms of socioeconomic status, they usually have more children. So,
sure.
If it was the case, I guess, this is just an hypothesis, that children would have some mechanisms that they were to use to try to interfere with, for example, their parents' sexual activity and trying to prevent them from having more children, then that would make even more sense in a context where they would be more limited in terms of resources, and so it would make more sense for that sort of thing to manifest in those contexts, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I could see it going either way, because, one strategy is to have less, right? But it might be, I guess it would depend on how much resources are available, because I could also see the strategy that, well, have a child with this man, maybe this will be the man that's going to invest in us, you know, and so I could see it going either way. I can see an argument for both strategies. Better something than nothing. If we don't try, we have nothing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's sort of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
As you were talking, I was thinking about not just the issue of resources available, but I wonder whether children from a previous mateship might be more likely to interfere with a parent's mating strategy, because there you're going to share genes, but only through the mother. I don't know. I have to think about this.
I guess that another element that could be added here is the fact that, I've already talked with some anthropologists, and it seems that at least in more traditional societies, and I'm talking about primarily hunter-gatherers, that people also take their children as economic assets, in the sense that after they reach a certain age, they can be put to work and to producing more resources. That doesn't happen in our modern societies, also because we have laws set in place against that. But that could be another thing, or another factor, let's say, that could play a role in children not interfering with their parents having more siblings, let's say, because they would also be helping them in a sense.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think, that's a different way of thinking about it. The one thing that I just thought about too, an interesting, conflict, where a woman has a child from a previous marriage, is the relationship between her and her new partner and that child. So, the things so it's parent-offspring conflict, but only in the interest of maintaining the romantic partner. So you need to behave well, do exactly what he says. So it's, maintaining resources, but also sort of protecting her, the child too from any sort of abuse or, maltreatment by the new partner. So in some ways, it's sort of acknowledging that, that there's a cost to having a child, but there might be more of, that the outcome might be more beneficial if she, maintains this relationship with this new partner.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this now, because at least in our modern industrialized societies, I guess that in most of them, at least the ones that I know about, when there's a conflict or parents go through divorce, I mean, most of the time the custody of the children is given to the mother. And I mean, that has, I guess, a very good evolutionary basis to it, because as we talked about here, mothers tend to invest more in their children and tend to be less neglecting, let's say. But could it also be the case that the paternity uncertainty heuristic, let's say, could also operate at the level of the children's minds, in the sense that maybe that would lead them to also establish a better relationship with their mother than with their parent, with their father, because they would also take, I mean, this is a bit weird to think about, but that they in some sense would also somewhat know that there's a higher probability that they are the true children of their mother, and when it comes to the father, I mean, it's less probable.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I would anticipate that, well, you'd have to get kind of clever in how you investigate this, but yes, I would think that it's a two-way street. So mothers are investing more and are more reliable investors in their children. But I think it's also the case, as you're suggesting, that children's minds may be built to sort of anticipate greater likelihood of investment from a parent with whom you certainly share genes. You may or may not share genes with a father, with the social father. And so I could imagine that children generally will report and, would report greater comfort, better relationship overall, and greater trust with mothers than with fathers. And so what would be interesting is to try to peel apart, is this an effect of mothers, or what is the effect of mothers? What is the effect, as distinct from the effect of children's psychology? There may be two different effects going on there, which kind of feed into each other. Yeah, absolutely.
So let me just ask you one last question, and we've already talked about parent-offspring conflict, and we speculated a little bit here, and I guess that this can get very psychoanalytical very quickly, but I mean, do you know if there's any literature on how people might be affected by witnessing their parents having sex? I mean, because I was just thinking from an anthropological perspective, let's say, and thinking about how we evolved in hunter-gatherer societies. I mean, I'm not sure if people, when they want to have sex, if they move into a place that they try to be a little bit more private or not, but since we know from behavioral genetics that basically most of what parents do doesn't have at least an overlasting effect on their children's development. I mean, there are people, as I was alluding to, the psychoanalysts that, I mean, sometimes bring up these ideas that children witnessing this and that, in this case particularly parents copulating, could have some sort of negative effect in their lives. But do you know, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, if that would make any sense?
You want to?
No.
So, I mean, kids don't go blind, for example. You know, I don't know of any good work on that. I mean, my general sense is most people are disgusted by the thought of their parents having sex, but that may be sort of confounded with, I don't know that it's your parents having sex so much as just thinking about one or the other of your parent in a sexual kind of context is disgusting, just as it is imagining having sex with a sibling. And so I'm not sure that we need to dig any further than, people projecting themselves into a sexual situation that involves their genetic relatives. I think it's such a powerful anti-aphrodisiac, disgust elicitor, that I don't think we necessarily have to go to. I mean, what you want to do is you want to look at how unsettling or disgusting is it to find your father having sex with your mother versus find your father having sex with his lover. I mean, my guess is having sex with his lover is going to be significantly less disgusting, but probably still disgusting. But anyways, the point is, I don't know of any. I don't know of any. I don't know if you do, but I don't know of any good empirical work on this, other than the anecdotal stuff of I still remember when I was 3, and I saw this, or but that's kind of muddled up with sort of the cultural sort of psychoanalytic, stuff we all drag around. I mean, I just don't know. It would be kind of interesting, I suppose. I just don't know how to get at it. I'd have to really think about how to get at that. I mean, because if you think about it, most sex does not produce children. I mean, right. The rate of conception per copulation for consensual sex is about 3%. So about 3 in 100 copulations will result in a conception. But from the child's perspective, I'm not saying you want to witness it, but you would want your parents to be maintaining sexual activity, because the absence of sexual activity is a wonderful predictor for divorce and dissolution. So you've got all kinds of, powerful, sort of forces pushing and pulling.
So I'm speaking again. I have no knowledge of any research on this, especially from an evolutionary perspective. But when you were bringing up the incest idea, it made me think about, the secrecy that parents engage in, so so as not to traumatize the children, so it's almost like like we would protect our children from getting hit by a car, right, or experiencing upsetting things. So I mean, maybe that's why I think anecdotally parents do it in secrecy, or they wait till the children go to sleep, or they do it in another bedroom or another room. They go out of their way to, protect their children.
Not as if they think there's a bad effect.
Right, and it might be because, like you're saying, if it has something to do with incest avoidance and perceiving yourself involved in sexual activity with your mother or father, then that's, I think, in a healthy mind, it's disgusting. Right. So you're sort of protecting the child from experiencing that, just like you wouldn't want them to ingest, ammonia or something like that.
But you wouldn't.
But I think also that healthy romantic behavior, is also a good indicator to the child that everything is good here. You're good. You're taken care of. So that's also important to communicate.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
It certainly is interesting, and I guess that we are speculating a little bit here in this episode, and there's no problem about that because we're saying that these are just hypotheses to put on the table. But I guess that I just decided to ask you about that because it could be the case that there could be some sort of literature out there that I didn't know about, and I mean people keep putting or coming up with these hypotheses or these wild ideas about how children might be affected by their parents in 1,000 different ways, including how children might be affected just by looking at their parents or even other people's naked bodies. I mean, we get into places where it starts making no sense at all, because I mean, we evolved naked, right? And so I mean, we've been having clothes in our societies, and even hunter-gatherer ones, for a very long time. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, people have been living in close quarters with one another and seeing themselves and other people mostly naked. So I mean, I won't imagine any way that would affect children negatively. So
no. I mean, I would predict that seeing a parent having sex will have, my prediction is that it will have absolutely no long-term consequences.
Well, yeah, I would say yes, if we were just talking about, I think, healthy sex. I mean, if...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, at any rate, yeah, I mean, even terrible things that happen in life, I guess it depends, but there's no guarantee that, that there's going to be some kind of negative outcomes.
Yeah, and it also depends a lot on people's personality, because I mean, even very bad events in life, I mean, they affect people differently. There are people that are more that react more negatively to those sorts of things and even develop depression and anxiety and things like that. And there are other people that simply take that as bumps on the road or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to keep in mind too is the age of the child, because a very young child is not going to know what to make of, sex.
Parents can still say they're just wrestling.
They're wrestling.
So right, of course.
Yeah. So and then so the issue then of having that privacy. I think the kids, as they get older, they know what's happening, right? So they're not going to want to be there or go out of their way to try to come into the bedroom or, they get it. But as a child, I think you're right, that it probably, so developmentally, what do they do with this information or what they're visualizing, I guess is, not much as a child.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that at the level of they're saying that they were wrestling or something like that. I guess that they could say that they were going through just a schedule of rough and tumble play to prepare for hunting, something like that.
Yeah, and if you say wrestling, that sounds better than, mommy was being a bad girl, type of thing.
Right. Yeah, right.
Right. Okay, so guys, it was really nice to have this conversation with you. Just before we go, I mean, would you like to tell people again what are the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Sure, but before we do that, we just thought your viewers might appreciate knowing, well, we'd like to tell them that we are co-hosting the next Human Behavior and Evolution Society meeting in 2020. It'll be in June of 2020, June 24th through the 27th. It'll be in Detroit. Our university is about an hour from Detroit, but we're going to host it in downtown Detroit at the Renaissance Center. And I mean, if you're interested in evolutionary psychology, this really is the place to be at this conference. And so we're super excited about that. And again, we've been doing what we can to get the word out, and we'll continue to get the word out. But you can find HBES 2020. You can find information about HBES 2020 at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society website, which is hbes.com. Then I think you can also find information about HBES 2020 on Facebook and Twitter. So just want to make sure we got that out there.
And actually, quite a few of the people that you interview actually attend HBES, the HBES conferences. So it might be kind of fun for those who are interested in, evolution and human behavior to attend the conference, and they could run into a few people they've seen on your YouTube channel.
Yeah. We think it's going to be the best conference yet.
That's our goal. Yes. Best attendance ever.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm still pursuing my Darwinian Diva, so if viewers would like to explore that on Facebook and on Twitter, I'd appreciate it. And I also have a website, Darwinian Diva, as well.
Yeah, darwiniandiva.com.
Yep.
Yeah. I think I do have a website. It's my name, toddshackelford.com, where you can find a lot of our joint work,
Yep.
as well as information about our students and our graduate students. So, yep, we're not super active on social media, although Viviana has been much more active. Yeah, yeah, much more active with Darwinian Diva, and we're really making a push with HBEST 2020 to make sure we get the word out as best we can. So, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving all of that in the description box of the interview, and good luck with the conference. I haven't attended yet any HBES, but I hope that in the future I will be able to do so in a way or another, because I guess that's the biggest annual conference on evolutionary psychology, right?
Yeah, I mean, we anticipate 600 or more people, and they're from all over the world, and very established researchers, also new researchers, and it really is a genuinely wonderful conference. I mean, it's not just psychologists, it's biologists, anthropologists. Again, as Viviana mentioned, many of the people that you've spoken to. Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great to meet you in person, and we'd be delighted to do that.
Okay, great. So, guys, Todd, Viviana, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. I know you're very busy, and you've already been on the show several times, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Ricardo.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you also have the alternatives of Subscribestar and PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Gondriano, Jana Eninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Doctors Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.